Just how big a gamble did Sweden take with its herd immunity approach to COVID-19? Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to the France 24 debate. Spring has sprung, and I gotta say, there's a bit of cabin fever gripping most of Europe. It's been more than 6 weeks of confinement here in France. We've been in lockdown. So our gaze shifts northwards to the Scandinavian nation of less than 11 million, where the government's popularity is through the roof because they bucked the trend and left primary schools open, restaurants and shops as well. But what do the numbers really say? The death toll there is soaring too, with the virus most notably tearing through nursing homes. The payoff, argue the Swedes, is that more than an estimated 1/4 of the population is now immune to the coronavirus. We will study the facts and compare what is comparable. We'll ask, what is the cost, the true cost of herd immunity? By the way, herd immunity, well, that used to be the norm everywhere. They didn't have lockdown when the Asian flu hit in 1957, the Hong Kong flu at the end of the 1960s. France has forgotten how hospitals here were overrun, morgues overwhelmed. Back then, people just carried on, they say. Why? And more broadly, will humanity's embrace of a zero-risk mind frame ultimately save lives, or will it prolong the pain? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Sweden's herd immunity gamble. And joining us from Stockholm, Dr. Johan van Schrieb, professor and head of the Center for International Disaster Medicine at the Karolinska Institute. Thank you for being with us. I should also say, you're one of the co-founders of the Swedish chapter of Doctors Without Borders. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Also with us from the Swedish capital, virologist Lina Einhorn. You are one of the co-signatories of an open letter to the government, which we'll talk about later, questioning herd immunity tactics. We'll go into that. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
From the French capital, Ingrid Burgo, of the Paris staff of the Local France. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And also in Paris, Dr. Anne-Marie Moulin, historian of medicine and philosopher. Welcome to the show.
And medical doctor.
Medical doctor as well, yes. I'm in the company of 3 doctors. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter. The hashtag is F24debate. Yeah, the Asian flu of 1957. Anne-Marie Moulin, 1969 here in France. You look at the numbers, and it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 killed at the time. How do those pandemics from the past compare with today?
If we compare it to the Spanish flu, during the Spanish flu, we had nothing. We didn't even know which virus was it.
This is 1918, just at the tail end of World War I.
Okay, 1918. In 1918, we didn't know what was the virus. We were still discussing the fact that maybe it was a bacteria. So it means not only we did not know who was the virus, but of course, we did not have any vaccine, molecules, we had nothing. So it was basically the chaos. And besides that, the memory of the pandemics was that of a terrible disaster linking war, international war, deadly war, and epidemics. So basically, we know now that the number of the dead was about in the world was about the same as the people who were killed in the war. So this mixture of war and epidemics was just a picture and a remembrance of chaos.
But what about 1957? What about 1968? Those seem to have been erased from our collective memory. Nobody talks about them here in France.
Very little, especially 57 and more than that, 68. My generation, who unfortunately lived already at that time, does not remember anything. Even if I was for the second one, I mean the one of 68, I was a medical student. And in fact, I remember, of course, May 68, but not the epidemic. I remember it because I read it in books. But as a living person, I don't remember anything.
And yet, for the time being, the death toll is higher from that period of 1968 to 1970 when you had the Hong Kong flu here in France. You had an astounding number of 1/3 of rail workers in France, 1/3 of postal workers who were laid off, who were off work because they were sick at the time. And yet, as Anne-Marie was saying, people didn't really talk about it much. They got on with their lives, they say. Let's take a listen.
Nous sommes une famille où nous avons des carcasses de fer. Nous ne prenons jamais rien. Autrement dit que nous sommes invulnérables.
De toute façon, si on l'a, ben on l'a. Hein. On ne peut rien y faire.
Il n'y a pas lieu de s'affoler, parce que cette épidémie évoluera probablement comme une épidémie saisonnière assez banale.
Yeah, Anne-Marie Moulin, what do you think when you listen back to people back then and today and the zero risk mind frame that today's world has?
I think the zero, you're right. The zero risk is mentality is invading our minds. And I think it was partly fostered by, firstly, the idea that maybe medicine could extend life to, I don't know, 100 years, 1 century for everybody. The second thing is that the threat of terrorism was very important since September 11. And since September 11, people are obsessed by the safety, the protection from the foreigners, many things. So I think the risk of the epidemic and the wish zero death is very important.
Let me ask.
Very important.
Let me ask Johan van Schrieb, Dr. van Schrieb. Is there a zero risk mentality as well in Sweden, or are the Swedes more philosophical about it all, fatalistic?
I think we are just like everybody else in the modern world. I think we have the same type of perspective that life is going to go on forever, and so the living with the risk. I think it's exactly the same thing as the previous speaker highlighted. The same perspective here, I would say.
And what do you see as the big difference between 1968 and today when you think back to the Hong Kong flu?
Well, it's the rapid access to information, and also I would say that fear has also been a very significant part of this epidemic, and also somehow that everybody feels they have a role to play, and maybe before we were more sort of just listening to the regulations and we followed them and nobody were questioning them. I think this time everybody has become an epidemiologist and everybody wants to question also the different strategies we can compare between countries, and so everybody becomes specialists somehow, even though they don't have that broad perspective and the experience.
One of the keys for Sweden, and this is something we can talk about with the whole panel, but I'll bring in you, Ingrid Burgo, when you compare Scandinavia and here where we are in France, one of the keys is faith in the public service, faith in what the government is telling you.
Definitely. I cannot speak for Sweden, but I can compare a little bit to Norway, which has followed a similar strategy as France has. And what we've seen is basically the same thing that we've seen here in France. People have largely complied with the rules issued by the government. And I was talking to my family earlier today, and they're all very much in agreement with what the government has been doing. And that seems very cross-political. It doesn't matter if you're supporting the government from the outset, but everyone has largely welcomed the restrictive measures from the government on society.
And in the case of Sweden, we've seen a prime minister's popularity has soared. Let's listen to what he had to say last week, as he said, yes, we're keeping the country open, but you must respect social distancing rules nonetheless on a voluntary basis.
Så det är inte aktuellt att lätta på restriktioner och rekommendationer. Tvärtom så är regeringen redo att fatta ytterligare beslut om det skulle behövas för att begränsa smittspridningen.
Lina Einhorn, do you have faith in your government's approach?
Well, it's not so much an issue of the government. We have a system in Sweden whereby it really is the government sort of accepts, the government makes the formal decision, but it accepts the advice from the expert agencies, in this case, the Public Health Agency of Sweden. And so it's not, the government very, very much takes a back seat. And it really is the Public Health Agency in Sweden that runs the show to a large extent.
And people have faith in it. They trust those civil servants. You just heard Johan van Schrieb say, everybody's an epidemiologist today.
Well, he said that because he thinks everybody does not trust it, I assume. But I would say that Sweden is really, really polarized right now. There's probably still more that say that they want to abide, everybody abides, but they trust the Public Health Agency, then say that they don't, but it's extremely polarized right now.
Extremely polarized. Let's talk about it. Johan van Schrieb, do you support the government's decision to keep the country open?
I don't agree with Lena to say it's extremely polarized. I think there are certain people who claim that we should go a different direction. And we must remember that it is not the policy being implemented is not a laissez-faire type of policy going for herd immunity, but it's rather trusting people to do their best, rather than to have militaries at the street corner, or like in France where you have policemen giving out fines. We simply don't want that here. We want instead that this is done by a voluntary, collaborative way, and that people are also felt that they're part of this and taking responsibilities. And I have experience working with Ebola outbreak in Africa, and the main reason for the Ebola outbreak continuing, and now we still see it ongoing for over 2 years in Congo, DRC, has been the mistrust and the lack of confidence with the government. So I think it's extremely important that you have a policy that is sort of well accepted by the community, because without community trust, it doesn't matter what policy you implement. And it seems like you can, on one hand, be quite hard and have lockdowns, on the other hand, be more flexible, which is, and also ask more a voluntary social distancing and accepting isolation of the elderly, while, for example, maintaining kindergarten and primary school opens, which I think has been good, and it's also made the children being able to live a relatively normal life rather than to be locked up.
All right, but let's look at the numbers. Vox flagging statistics that came out showing that the death rate in Sweden is on track to be higher than that of the United States, and much higher to any of its Scandinavian neighbors. Was it worth it, this strategy?
Well, I think these figures, death figures, are of course very difficult to compare. We know that death registration is done differently in different countries. It all depends who you compare with. Obviously, our neighboring countries have been better and more successful, which doesn't mean that is the lockdown that, for example, both Belgium and France have higher death rates than Sweden. So for me, I cannot see the real parallel between a lockdown and lower death rates. And here we're looking on a very difficult virus. We don't exactly know what the effects are. So I think we have to be very careful in interpreting these figures. And I think main explanation for these high death rates in Sweden has been the unfortunate that the virus has gotten into old people's home nurseries. We have between 80 to 90,000 old, very vulnerable people that normally, when they enter into these homes, don't have much more than 1 year to live in average before the COVID. And now the virus, when it enters into these old people's home, of course, it has a horrible effect, and a lot of them die. But on the other hand, those people could not have been saved with healthcare because they're simply too vulnerable. So we're looking on two different aspects. One is the more preventive, where the main aim is to protect these people from getting the disease. But if they get it, unfortunately, stand a high risk of dying. And then you have the curative side, which is...
Hold on. Before we talk about the curative side, let me bring in Lina Einhorn on this. Do you agree? I mean, 3/4 of Swedish nursing homes have reported cases of COVID-19. Do you agree that whether or not there's lockdown, that wouldn't have made a difference?
It's in the Stockholm region. Three quarters of the old age facilities in the Stockholm region, and 40% of the home care facilities in the Stockholm region have COVID-19. It is very obvious that Sweden has taken a different track and has also a different result than the other Scandinavian countries. And the reason you have to compare with the other Scandinavian countries is manifold. One is that the culture is similar, the distance to the epicenters is the same, and most importantly, it started at the same time in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, and 1 week later in Finland. And so the numbers are indeed very comparable. Now you can say you count deaths in a slightly different way, but if anything, Sweden counts deaths lower than, for instance, Norway, because Sweden only counts deaths when it has been confirmed by a test that the person who died had COVID-19. So today, Sweden has 6.5 times more deaths per million inhabitants than Finland, 6 times more than Norway, and 3 times more than Denmark and Germany, by the way. So.
And was it worth it, this gamble? The idea being that now more of the population might be immune.
Absolutely. It's, that's another issue. There are many issues here. This herd immunity thing. I mean, there are now, the antibody testing is just now really starting. And what we are finding is that there's nowhere near herd immunity, but what it is clusters. And the clusters are concentrated and explosive. But if you look, and this is stuff that is not yet published, in some countries it is, but in Sweden it's not yet. When you look broadly in the Stockholm community, you do not find a high rate of infection at all, but you find these clusters, like in a hospital or in the old age homes. We're nowhere near herd immunity. And if we are trying to get herd immunity, we're going to have a devastation in this society.
And Marie Moulin, a day doesn't go by in this country when I don't hear a story on the radio or see one on TV or read one in the newspaper about Sweden. What are your thoughts on this?
My thought on what?
The thoughts on whether or not the lockdown strategy was the right one.
Personally, I was hoping for a similar strategy because I thought that the terrible lockout we decided was something that would be devastating for the poorest people, the migrant, the poor, the vulnerable. So I was hoping not exactly the same strategy as the Swedish one, but something more flexible and paying more attention precisely to the places where you could have these clusters of cases. For example, now we have strong differences between the parts of the country, and precisely the plan for ending the lock announced by our minister is giving space to these differences between population and places, and that would be very difficult to manage because after something which was decided in a very authoritarian way, giving no choice to anybody, suddenly, when we are going to progressively return to the normal life, our minister is giving a hand to all kinds of levels, the mayor, the prefect, the shopkeepers, who will manage whether they give something, they sell something or not, somebody who's entering the shop without a mask. So, I mean, we are experiencing these differences in real life. For example,
we see lockdown has accentuated social inequality. We see, Dr. Moulin, how where essential care workers live, the infection rate is higher. They've paid a higher price throughout, no doubt about it. But if the country had been left open, would it have been any different on that score?
If the country had been managed differently, you mean?
If they had not instituted a lockdown or confinement.
Right. What would have happened? That's your question. You asked me a very difficult question. I was expecting the result would be probably mitigated. I don't know if it would have avoided the death that would have been avoided. Probably not so many, because as my Scandinavian colleague explained, in the homes for older people, anyway, these people were more or less doomed to death. I don't dare to say things like that, but it would have made a big change.
Ingrid, let me bring in Ingrid Bergo on this. Ingrid, back on March 16th, when the lockdown began, there was no other option in this country. In places like Mulhouse in the eastern Alsace region, in Paris area hospitals, the intensive care units were overwhelmed. There was no other choice but to opt for confinement at that point. Now that the numbers are going down, what are your thoughts?
That's exactly it. France didn't really have a choice when it introduced the lockdown on May 17th. And let's just go back a little bit, because it was interesting what Johan in Sweden said about lockdown and high death rates not being very much related. Because if we compare, for example, France and Norway, Norway had its first case of coronavirus confirmed 1 month after France, so on February 26th. Norway introduced a partial lockdown, not as strict as the French one, on March 12th. So 5 days before the French one. By then, Norway had one person dead from the coronavirus. France introduced a lockdown 5 days later, when it had 175 deaths confirmed. What we saw in Norway was that instantaneously, nearly, there are new numbers that have come out on this now, the lockdown worked. So death rates went down, hospital rates went down. And now what Norway is seeing is that the virus is completely under control and they can start to deconfine. And then there were a lot of ifs and buts, because obviously Norway is a tiny country. We have 5 million inhabitants, that it's obviously a lot easier to control the virus when you have that few people. But however, we're seeing that France is also showing results that are proving that the lockdown is indeed working. And as you said, France didn't really have a choice. This was not something that the government did because it really wanted to lock the country down. It was done because it needed to save the country's hospitals.
Johan van Schrieb, do you agree?
No, I mean, lockdowns, it can buy you time, obviously, to ensure that you prepare the hospitals and to get more protective equipment. Of course, it can do that. But I mean, it also depends when you impose the lockdown in this, what time in the epidemic. But at the end of the day, you have to open up also, and to find a medium way is of course the very challenging here too. Because I mean, at the end of the day, herd immunity, you must achieve it somehow by it. I mean, it seems to be that every country will need to get some sort of herd immunity. We cannot get this virus away. I mean, you can't keep the lockdown for another 18 months. And personally, my mother died last weekend, not in COVID though, but she was suffering so hard from this isolation that she could not stand being by herself. So I've seen it personally, what the suffering from being locked down, and it's not an alternative for a lot of people. They if they have 6 months to live in general, if they cannot during this time meet their relatives, etc. So that's also extremely high price tag. So I don't think it's either or, that you can something is good and something is bad. We're dealing with a horrible virus, and we're trying in different ways to deal with it. We don't know, because it's a new virus, so we don't know what is the best way to deal with it. And that's why this type of programs are very important to try to share the experience. And I don't want to defend the Swedish policy. I just sort of see it in front of me. I live with it, and personally, I think it's better from my perspective to at least not to have policemen on the street stopping me, and that children can go to school. I think that's, from my perspective, a better option that has not shown to be so devastated as some people claim.
Well, our thoughts are with you, Dr. van Schrieb, after your personal loss there. I want to turn to Lina Einhorn. You're one of 22 doctors who on April 24th signed an open letter to the government that was published by leading business daily Dagens Nyheter, You say the approach must be changed radically and quickly. Is there any sign of that happening?
First of all, it was April 14th.
April 14th, excuse me.
Yeah, it's okay. The problem is, this discussion has been focusing completely on lockdown, and there are many other aspects to what's happening in Sweden today. To answer your question first, has it shifted? No, it hasn't. The discussion may have shifted, but the policies have not. Now, what I want to bring up is, because we're constantly focusing here on lockdown. And the thing is that what has happened in Sweden is not only a result of lockdown or not lockdown, but there are other fundamental mistakes that have been done that, in my and many other people's opinion, has led to the high death rates. The first one was that the Swedish Public Health Agency, for the longest time, did not believe there would be an epidemic in Sweden. Well into February, they said Sweden is not going to have an epidemic, we're going to have single cases. And the result of this attitude was that they did not prepare. So they did not build up the protection, face mask, all kinds of other protection capacity. And the second thing was...
if I could interrupt, Lina, that is the same story here in France. It's the same story in many countries.
Let me just finish. And the second thing is that they did not build up the testing capacity. So when the first cases came, they had the testing capacity to do contact tracing, but they didn't have any broader capacity. And when we started having communal spread, they had to shift away from contact tracing and only focus on those people who ended up in hospital. So the preparedness was really poor. And countries have prepared differently. I mean, South Korea developed their testing capacity tremendously fast. I know that the issue of protective gear is international, but there was like at least 4 weeks of doing very, very little when much more could have been done. The second and very fundamental problem in the Swedish approach, and to me, unbelievable refusal to change policy, is that Sweden, unlike most countries and also the international organizations, still does not recognize the importance of pre-symptomatic spread, meaning that you can spread the virus before you have symptoms. Now with SARS, you couldn't. And so many people assumed it would be the same because it's a similar kind of virus. But in fact, with this coronavirus, you get very, very infectious at least a day before you have symptoms. And the highest load of virus is the day before and the day after you get symptoms. Now that has to affect policy. And in Sweden, it hasn't. In Sweden, not only do we not have a general recommendation of using face masks, but there is a non-recommendation of using face masks even in the elder care unless you're dealing with a sick patient. And so the reason they are still saying they are investigating why we have 75% of the Stockholm region old age facilities that have been affected by COVID-19, but it's very clear what the reason is. It's not, mainly at least not, that people have come, the personnel have come in sick and have pretended to be healthy, but the main reason is that the personnel has come in pre-symptomatic, and they have been told not to wear face masks and other gear unless they are dealing with a sick patient. And
Dr. Go ahead. I was going to ask Dr. Van Schrieb, is that changing, especially on this issue of face masks?
I'm no specialist on face mask, but I know that it's a very tricky thing to wear a face mask correctly. And having the experience when working with Ebola and where you have untrained people using face masks and protective gear, it's extremely dangerous, and it can be even more dangerous to wear face masks in the wrong way or take it off in the wrong way. So I'm not so convinced that you can just by spreading face masks to people and protective gear that things will change. I also don't agree with a lot of what Lena is saying, that she makes a clear connection. And I think it's an illusion to think that you could be prepared. I mean, I've been working now with both WHO and MSF in many countries, disaster affected, to be prepared is something that is not happening now. It's not until the knife cuts the skin that people start acting, and it's unfortunate that it is that way. But if you look around, that's how we react to climate change. And
surely South Korea. Surely the fact that South Korea has managed this so well is because in 2015 they were hit hard by previous coronavirus, and therefore they were more aware.
Of course they were, and that's precisely what I'm saying. It's not until you've been affected by either SARS or MERS-CoV virus that, and you see the countries that were affected by those viruses, that they had a much better preparedness. Before they were cut, they knew what was happening. But I think for most, this risk awareness that we were talking about initially, it's simply not there. We think we can continue with our life, and it's, with this virus, it was very difficult to predict how it was going to behave, because SARS and MERS-CoV were not so contagious, and they were not spreading in the same way. So I think a lot of the preparation was based on how that was spread. But nevertheless, the countries in Asia, they had, done their homework very well. But because they had the experience of being really badly hit, and I think it's not until that happens that countries and individuals prepare. Unfortunately, that seems to be a bit of a human behavior. We tend to stick our head in the sand and avoid this until it actually happens.
All right, I want to talk about a key figure in all of this, and he's become known, well, worldwide. You were mentioning at the outset how in Sweden, the government defers to the public health authorities. The chief epidemiologist his name is Anders Tegnell. Let's listen to him speaking a few weeks ago.
We're trying to do exactly what other countries do. We're trying to slow down the spread as much as possible by giving advice on how to behave for individuals, all in the effort to minimize social contacts as much as possible.
All right, not the perhaps the most charismatic of public speakers. Nonetheless, we've seen hip hop artists sing his praises. And we've even seen one person brandish the tattoos he was having put on at his local tattoo parlor on Instagram. He spoke to the Reuters news agency and said why he decided to do that.
And when I saw my friend Sasha here doing this gnugis, as it's called in Swedish, I thought like, oh man, I want that on my arm for real. So then I asked him if he could do it for me.
So can you explain to us, Lina Einhorn, why is it that the country's chief epidemiologist has become this cult hero?
I think there are several aspects. There are two aspects to it. One is that in a crisis, people act in different ways, but most of us want to at least trust authority. It gives us a sense of security, because what else is there to hold on to? I think that's one reason. The second reason is that he has a very calming way of speaking, and he keeps repeating that we are entering a flattening phase in the death rates, which is a very strange statement. But the reason is partially that the curve is always going down because there is a delay in today's deaths, if you follow me. So if you just report today's deaths, which they do every day, then today's deaths keep rising afterwards, and you always have a downward slope the later you look at the curve. So this we are flattening out, and everything is beginning to look better. He's been saying that now for weeks, and so far we haven't seen that. It has been rising. So I think the combination of this calming message and the fact that people are always looking for security are the two factors that play in there.
Ingrid Berger, what do Norwegians make of the cult of Anders Tegnell, the chief epidemiologist?
I think we look at the Swedes, or Norwegians look at the Swedes and say either they're geniuses or they're just completely, utterly mad. We don't understand what's going on in Sweden right now. Norwegians really wanted the government to introduce stricter restrictions in the beginning of the epidemic when Denmark did it. The government was actually responding to calls for stricter measures. Right now, I think we're just looking to Sweden and saying it doesn't look like they have it right now, but no one knows how this will all end.
Nobody knows how it will end. It's almost like there's a bit of, and I'll put this to you, Anne-Marie Moulin. Since the pandemic, scientists suddenly find themselves at the heart of culture wars. We've seen that here in France with the man who's been touting hydrochloroquine in Marseille, Dr. Eric Raoult. What are your thoughts on this chief epidemiologist becoming a social media star?
I think we were expecting heroes, as was being discussed just now. We need heroes. And these last years, I think there was a decline of the physician, of the medical doctor as a hero. That's very sad and has various reasons. So there was a kind of void. And the population, the people, if you like, was expecting a hero. And just Raoult was the right man at the right time. And as he was certainly liking the whole thing, he emerged on the scene as a hero with his proposal of chloroquine. But you have to know that this idea of a chloroquine with an antibiotics, he had used it, he had meditated this thing since long. In fact, he had experienced chloroquine for other types of fevers with an antibiotic, and his main idea was that if you give an antibiotic and plaquenil or chloroquine...
Yeah, but the point is that afterwards it's become this huge debate where people, again, who are not doctors at all, are taking sides for him or against him, depending on their political allegiances, depending on whether or not they trust their government. People project in these moments, don't they?
Unfortunately, I think it betrays precisely the lack of trust in the medical profession, in science, in medical science, and in the government. So Didier, you changed the first name. Didier Raoult. Didier Raoult emerged as a man who is challenging the establishment, which is very strange because, in fact, he was the dean of the medical school in Paris. He was not exactly an outsider, and he's a member of the medical council that assists the government in its decisions. But he spoke directly to the population, saying that you are betrayed by epidemiologists who are lagging with the standardized trials, which ask for 18 months to have a vaccine and so on. Well, I give you immediately the right treatment, and you have to forget about all these standardized trials. And this proposal, I think, was something which pleased the people. They had a hero.
All right, so Johan van Schriep, what does that tell you? The Swedes turning to this authority figure who speaks in a calming voice, the French turning to this long-haired doctor in a white lab coat who's a bit of a rebel. What does that tell you?
I don't know what it tells me. I mean, I have experience with working with Médecins Sans Frontières, so I have a bit of a understanding of that aspects. And I would have expected French people to be more resistant towards these lockdown and more protests. And it's interesting to note how it tends to be that nationally, I mean, not only does the work concentrate in your home country, but also the attitude of the people seems to be that you are in line with what the policies are in your particular country. And it could be that the cultural aspects of it are very important. As I said initially, I think this thing with trust and also understanding the community, how they will react, is so essential. And maybe we are a bit different here of who we trust, but Anders Tegnell,
trust which only takes you so far. The Guardian picking up on a story in the local Swedish press. It's Walpurgis Night coming up throughout Scandinavia, an important spring festival. And the university town of Lund has decided to dump a ton of chicken manure in its central park in a bid to deter the locals from gathering and disrespecting social distancing norms, and to try to keep them from celebrating. So, Ingrid Burgo, does that confirm that the Swedes are sensible or mad?
You know what? I've actually been quite surprised with the Swedes during this whole thing, because in Norway, there's this stereotype that the Swedes are the Germans of the north of Scandinavia, which is to say that they're the most rule-conforming of all of us. And here they are, not complying to the rules that most of the other European countries are handing out. So it's very interesting sociologically to kind of observe. We used to joke that if Swedes go into a bar and the tables aren't pushed together, then they'll sit at separate tables and not push the tables together, instead of actually doing something that's a little bit outside of the box. Yeah, we'll see. Maybe the Swedes have it right. Who knows? No one knows how this is going to end.
No, that's right. We are in uncharted territory. Ingrid Burgo, I want to thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank Dr. Anne-Marie Moulin, Dr. Lina Einhorn, Dr. Johan van Schrieb for being with us. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate. There's much more on our website, france24.com, and also on Facebook, and you can follow us on our YouTube channel. Always trust what the correspondent tells you. When Emmanuel Soji calls us on a Friday night to say that 2 Frenchmen have been kidnapped in northern Benin, even if authorities here in Paris aren't talking about it, I know it's true because I know how hard she's worked to verify that information. I too was once a West Africa correspondent, and you wouldn't believe the amount of information, true or false, that people throw your way that you then have to check and double check. A more recent example, there were the news agency wires talking about a massacre in Mali. Our correspondent Christelle Pire calls up, says, wait before you give the toll. I'm still fact checking it. We want to go fast, but you know what? We waited.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.